Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to try to sort out all of the different types of Hussars. First of all, we have the Winged Hussar, with a pretty self-explanatory name, and then there's the Magyar Huszar, which also have wings. And finally, the Hussar, yes, also featuring wings. The point is, you'd be forgiven if you're a little confused about how all of these units compare, given their similar names and features, especially how much of an improvement the new Winged Hussar is over the regular Hussar. Now, for clarity's sake, I'm not going to include every civilization's Hussar bonuses in this video, like Mongols with more HP, Indians with more pierce armor, etc. And for the standard Hussar, I'm just going to be using a Spanish fully upgraded one. Just keep in the back of your mind that depending on the civilization, their Hussars could either be slightly better or worse than shown. On the other hand, I think Lithuanian and Polish Winged Hussars are different enough to separate, since one has trample damage and the other one doesn't. Throwing in the Magyar Huszar then gives us 4 different units that we'll be comparing. Now before we get into their differences, I think a good place to start is actually in the ways that they're similar. For example, they all share the same movement speed and are actually among the fastest units in the game. They also have almost the same attack rate. The Magyar Huszar does attack about 5% faster, but we can say it's still in the same ballpark. All 4 units also cost the same 80 food once Magyars research their Castle Age unique tech to remove their gold cost. So right away, we have some notable similarities that make all of the comparisons a bit more straightforward. Now that said, you could argue their cost isn't completely identical, as they all have different upgrade costs. To tech into a fully upgraded generic Hussar, including stable and blacksmith upgrades, is a little over 2,300 food and 1,400 gold. For the Poles, who have an additional unique tech for trample damage and the slightly more expensive Winged Hussar upgrade, getting all upgrades costs around an extra 500 food and gold on top of that. For the Lithuanians who missed the final attack upgrade, their Winged Hussars are actually a little cheaper to tech into than even generic ones. Finally, the cheapest, maybe surprisingly, is the fully upgraded Elite Magyar Huszar. That's only because they get free attack upgrades as a civilization bonus. From another viewpoint, they're also the most expensive though, as they need castles to be created, unlike the others. Castles aside though, Poles seem to have it the worst in terms of upgrade cost, and we'll see a bit later if that actually pays off with better results. For the moment though, with cost out of the way, now let's get into their stats. If we use 11 as the baseline attack, we notice that Poles' Winged Hussars have 2 more than that on top of trample damage, and the Elite Magyar Huszar has 3 more. Remember, it also attacks slightly faster as well. If we then treat the baseline as 3 melee and 6 pierce armor as it is for the generic Hussar, we can see the Poles have 2 lower pierce armor, and the Lithuanians have 1 more melee. Finally, for HP, it's pretty similar across the board, with the non-standard Hussars having a little bit more than usual. To put it succinctly, the Poles' Winged Hussar is a bit more specialized for melee and worse against ranged attacks, while the Lithuanians' Winged Hussar is maybe slightly tougher in general, and the Magyar Huszar seems to have the best all-around stats. It's really in their bonuses though that they start to show their different roles. The only bonus damage the regular Hussar has is plus 12 against monks, and some extra conversion resistance to go along with it. The Winged Hussars take that a step further and have a larger plus 14 bonus against monks, as well as an interesting plus 4 against gunpowder. The Magyar Huszar is completely different here and has plus 8 against siege with an extra 2 against rams specifically, but without any additional benefit against monks. Now 10 times out of 10, I'd take a bonus against siege over a bonus against monks, as siege is much more common to see in the late game and generally harder to deal with. The final hidden aspect I want to touch on is their creation time. Hussars and the Winged Hussar variant are created in 22.5 seconds at the stable after conscription. In contrast, the Magyar Huszar is created in about 12. That sounds pretty good until you remember they're created at castles. You usually have enough stone to get around 4 castles eventually and can buy stone from the market. But if we're talking about early Imperial Age or you're getting some of your castles taken down, that can be a major issue for Magyar Huszar production. In almost any case, it's easier to make 2 stables than it is to make 1 castle. So that's the comparison on paper, but now let's throw them into a few situations and see how the units hold up. Individually, head-to-head, the hierarchy is that the Magyar Huszar beats all of them, followed by the Polish Winged Hussar, and then by the Lithuanians, and finally with the generic Hussar, which loses to all 3. Given the Poles' trample damage though, I think it's worth trying this again on a larger scale as well. Using attack move and fighting 20 versus 20 against Hussars without trample damage, Poles win with about 35% of their HP left. That shows even before their Imperial unique tech, they have a comfortable margin over the generic Hussar already. If we repeat the test but add the Poles' unique tech, instead they end with 45% of their HP. The trample damage works by doing a third of their attack to adjacent enemy units after accounting for armor. so in most cases they should be doing around 3 damage per attack. For reference, the Cataphract's trample damage always does 5 regardless of armor, so it's actually a bit stronger. It's enough of a boost for Poles though that they can beat Bulgarian 33% faster attacking Hussars pretty easily, though the Poles' higher HP and base attack are undoubtedly helping here quite a bit as well. Putting the two types of Winged Hussars against each other without the Poles' trample damage, it's basically an even fight that could go either way. If we add in trample damage though, Poles win consistently with about 1/7 of their HP left. I have to admit, personally, I expected the effect of trample damage to be something more dramatic, and so far it seems to just be enough to swing an otherwise close fight. Even outnumbered 20 to 15, Poles aren't a match for Lithuanians, reinforcing that even with trample damage, you still need to take smart fights. Against the elite Magyar Huszar, of course, without trample damage, Polish Winged Hussars are handled pretty easily. With trample damage though, I saw anywhere from a basically completely even fight to a slight edge for Poles. As a general melee unit, I think massed Polish Winged Hussars seem at least on the same level as Magyar Hussars, or probably even a little stronger. Like I said earlier though, I'm a little surprised it's not having a more dramatic effect. To see how well this applies to a common unit they'll encounter, I set them against some Halberdiers with equal numbers. In that test, all 4 lost, so it's important to remember even Polish Winged Hussars and Magyar Hussars struggle a lot against Halberdiers. If we give the cavalry a slight numbers advantage though and make it 20 versus 15, that melee hierarchy with Poles at the top becomes obvious again, and they perform the best. Interestingly, Lithuanian Winged Hussars didn't hold up any better here than generic ones, as both take the same 3 hits and have identical attack values. Now, while sometimes I think it's useful to try a lot of different cases and matchups, here I suspect we're just going to keep seeing the same pattern over and over. Polish Winged Hussars with trample damage are a bit better than Magyar Hussars, and Lithuanians are similar or a bit better than generic. In terms of melee, I think we already have enough information to make a fairly good generalization. Instead, let's now switch to how they all do against archers. Using the Arbalester as a standard late-game archer, the obvious outlier is the Polish Winged Hussar, since it's missing the final armor upgrade. In fact, ignoring Poles, there's very little difference between the other 3, as they all have the same pierce armor and very similar HP. For a slightly more practical test, I attack moved a group of 30 Hussars into 40 fully upgraded Arbalesters. The generic Hussars ended with 29% of their HP left, which we can treat as a baseline. Lithuanian Hussars with 5 more HP in the exact same test ended with 31%, so as expected they're a tiny bit better, but the difference would be pretty hard to notice in practice. For the Polish Winged Hussar, each unit only takes about 2/3 of the arrows that Lithuanians do, so you might expect them to do terribly in comparison. Instead, they ended with 24% of their HP left, which isn't actually that far off the generic Hussar's 29. The thing to remember is against archers that are often bunched up, the trample damage is helping to balance out their lower armor. So while they're the worst out of the group, it's not as dramatic of a difference as you might expect. All 3 though are nothing compared to the elite Magyar Huszar in the same test, which ended with a whopping 53% of its HP. In a way, they really seem to be getting the best of both worlds, doing noticeably better in both melee and against ranged units when compared with the generic Hussar. Now, one final consideration and category I want to look at is how they compare at raiding. Given how poorly they trade against spear units and heavy cavalry, Hussars are often used primarily to raid villagers and win through starving an opponent of resources. In all 4 cases, when fully upgraded, they take out villagers in 4 hits, so the small differences in their attack don't really matter as much as you might think. Villagers are rarely bunched up enough for trample damage to factor in as well, meaning Polish Winged Hussars are probably the worst when it comes to raiding villagers given their lower pierce armor. Arguably, Magyar Hussars have the edge with slightly faster attack, but they also have lower line of sight and again need castles to create. And of the 4 that we're looking at, Lithuanian Winged Hussars may actually take the top spot for raiding. So to recap, in melee, I think Polish Winged Hussars are the best thanks to trample damage, though Magyar Hussars aren't too far behind and are probably the most useful if your opponent has a lot of siege. Against ranged units, the Magyar Hussar is hands down the best, and Poles end up doing the worst. In contrast, when raiding, I think the Lithuanians or even generic Hussars end up striking the best balance. Especially for Magyars with their discounted Hussar line, I actually think the regular Hussar makes for the best choice for raiding specifically. The most important category, of course though, is the beauty contest to see which one looks the coolest. Personally, I think the Magyar Hussar with its majestic lance takes this category, but I would be open to other opinions. That'll do it for this one though, and hopefully it helped tease out the subtle differences between the various winged units. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.